Okay, everybody, we will talk about the global financial system. And especially, we are talking about the time frame after the Second World War and how this global financial system developed after the 1945, especially starting with the Bretton Woods system. So this Bretton Woods system, especially led by the United States and Britain just after the Second World War, they actually solved the problems related to global capitalism and how, for example, rising nationalism and economic turmoil of the Great Depression and much of those protectionist policies of the era from Great Depression to Second World War actually caused disruptions in international trade and financial system. So most of the people look for some kind of a stability in this post-war period. So this Bretton Woods system and the foundation of these three institutions, IMF, World Bank, and General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs and Trade, all these three actually targeted to bring some kind of a stability in post-war international economy. So in terms of the tasks of these three institutions, first, IMF generally instituted or founded to provide financial assistance to those countries who have balance of payment problems. What is this balance of payment problems? It is related to government's revenues, expenditures. And generally, if the government revenues are lower than their expenditures, or their expenditures are much higher and much more than the revenues, then you can say a country is in some kind of a balance of payment problem or budget deficit. For example, if you are familiar with Turkish history, Turkish government since the 1970s, for example, consistently give budget deficits because the imports and the expenditures of these governments generally are bigger than the revenues. So because of that equation, generally you can expect these kind of budget deficit countries at certain points when they couldn't take, for example, repay their debt or couldn't sustain that position of budget deficits, generally they, in the capitalist world during the Cold War years, they generally went to IMF and signed these standby agreements with IMF conditionality and get some kind of a financial assistance from International Monetary Fund. What we look at in this balance of payments and budget deficits is first the current accounts of a country. We look at in terms of explaining this balance of payments. movement of goods and services, such as merchandise trade. These are all classified under the heading of current accounts. And generally, you can say physical goods, commodities, and services that people provide to each other were generally accounted when they were listed in the current accounts. And on the other side, what we see is the capital account of a country. What capital account is inflow and outflow of capital from and into a country. So in the capital accounts, you generally look for these unseen capital movements, especially foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investments, and all those kind of hot money, for example, that is go in and out of banking system or through the financial operations or to the stock markets or the bond markets of a country. So generally inflow in current accounts, for example, exports are a revenue, but in capital accounts, in the other side of the angle, or when you look at the perspective from the capital accounts, when you export money in your capital accounts, it's generally symbolized as minus because you are actually exporting money from your or capital from your country, and inflow of capital or attracting foreign investment in terms of capital to your country generally symbolized with a plus because it is generally seen as a revenue or a source of revenue in the balance of payments. So at the end of the fiscal year, when you look at a country's balance of payments, generally you look at all these kind of numbers. You put in a country's gross domestic product, and when you look at all the sides of the equation, if the plus side, revenues from all these commercial and capital transactions are bigger, then you are a surplus country. But if your country is on the minus side in terms of expenditures are much higher and much more than the revenues in that fiscal year, so it puts you into the negative territory and budget deficit country. So the main task in the 1950s for International Monetary Fund is to provide financial assistance to those countries, especially in the capitalist camp. And by providing that assistance, generally IMF also guaranteed the repayment of those debts to the international community or international financial investors or other countries. So it is some kind of a guarantee for the creditors, not only the debtor country. So it provides some kind of an stability to the international system, because if this issue of budget deficits, if it reaches some kind of an, actually you can say, a negative or unsustainable position or a situation, then, for example, debt defaults or bankruptcy of countries or declaring moratorium on their foreign debt wouldn't be very positive news for the international financial system. So to prevent those kind of situations of debt defaults and to bring stability, generally IMF has this task to provide financial assistance. The second important institution of this Bretton Woods system, World Bank, generally they have the task of, as we talked in the other classes before, their task is to provide project credits to infrastructure investments of countries. It can be, for example, healthcare, education, or other kind of highways, dams, all these kind of water sewage plants, for example, all these kind of things can be categorized as infrastructure investment or development assistance. So generally, most countries went to the World Bank with these kind of projects. And if they need these to develop these kind of projects, they can get development credit from the World Bank. And as we talked before in this class, general agreement on tariffs and trade is also the main task of the GATT is what they called the reduction of tariffs and trade, especially customs tariffs. So what they accomplish with reduction of these customs duties and trade tariffs, they are generally understood or perceived as some kind of an obstacle to the international movement of capital and movement of goods and services. So reduction of these trade barriers, what they called in the WTO or in World Trade Organization, if they can reduce these trade barriers, they generally look at it as a positive sign of development for the liberal free trade and free markets across the world. And especially during the Cold War, United States and Western alliance generally push and put pressure on the members of the international capitalist system after 1945 to reduce these trade barriers. So that this is another institution in the Bretton Woods is the fixed exchange rate system. What is this fixed exchange rate system? It is 1 ounce of gold equals to the 35 US dollars. So this fixed exchange rate system in the 1944 in the Bretton Woods Agreement, it provides some kind of a stability and future certainty to the future on the behalf of American leadership in the world capitalist system. Why it provides certainty? Because by giving this gold payment guarantee to the US dollars as an international reserve currency just after the Second World War, this is first acceptance of American leadership or American acceptance of this global leadership in the international capitalist system. Because if you have, for example, get into international transactions and international trade in the medium and long-term future, these kind of fixed exchange rates, some kind of a guarantee of your payments. For example, if you come up with 35 US dollars, the United States government actually guarantees, in US Treasury guarantees to pay you a 1 ounce of gold for that 35 US dollar, or vice versa. If you come up with gold, they will provide you equivalent amount of US dollars in that fixed exchange rate system. So it will provide certainty And these exchange rates brought stability to international trade, because most people actually perceived, or they were persuaded that the United States government will guarantee this smooth operation and smooth transaction in international system by actually guaranteeing or also indicating that they are behind this Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate systems. Robert Triffin, what he called Triffin dilemma in the 1940s and 50s discussions in the US Treasury and about the US economy. He argues that after a certain point, dollars around the world will inevitably surpass United States gold reserves. So he thinks, even though, for example, to provide some kind of an important stability to the system, you can, if you, for example, try to provide some kind of an stability to the system through this fixed exchange rate, after a certain point, dollars across the world and all international transactions will actually inevitably surpass the United States gold reserves, and it creates a dilemma. For example, he argues that even though United States accepted this leadership and this international position in the international financial system as a reserve currency and the guarantor, he said at that certain point, more than likely, this system cannot be sustainable, because when the amount of dollars surpass the gold reserves of the United States, how can you, for example, sustain this guarantee or provide those golds if people started to come up with these US dollars from around the world? So that creates some kind of a dilemma about the American leadership in the global economy after 1944. So if we go to the theoretical issues that your textbook discuss in terms of what happens to the international system, for example, in most of the time, as we discussed before in our class, first liberal, then mercantilists, close to the realists, and Marxist positions generally, they approach to this international system and the Bretton Woods system after the 1945. So what is this theoretical approach? For example, liberals argue that this kind of liberal free trade and less government intervention in international economy and opening up economies and reduction of trade barriers, for example, to increasing the power of markets to determine the determining the allocation of societal resources, is some kind of an actually positive development for all humanity, because free market and free trade, if they are not distorted by government intervention, liberals argued that it would be the best possible way to distribute and allocate resources. They actually look at this government intervention, price controls, or trade barriers as unnecessary trade disruptions. So liberals generally look at all these kind of government regulations and government standards, especially in terms of free movement of capital and free trade, as some kind of a trade barriers and unnecessary interventions. They look at it in a negative way. In mercantilists, they think they also somewhat share the same position with the liberals in terms of the allocation of resources. Best possible way is through capitalism and private property. So they don't have a fundamental difference in terms of their perceptions of the trade system. They don't differ from liberals, but what they differ is they think in sometimes for the interest of the state and interest of the governments should, for example, supervise and regulate this trade and capital movements across the world, because as we discussed in this class before, for example, like security issues, national security, military security, all those kind of reasons and state interest can be prior to this liberal free trade. So they argued that at sometimes, in order to allocate those resources in the best possible way from the perspective of state interest, there should be some restrictions on the free movement of capital and free trade. They differ from liberals in terms of how to apply these regulations. For example, they somewhat try to control the liberal capitalist system rather than opening up everything to foreign trade or free trade. So markets and their power are somewhat restricted from the perspective of state interest in the mercantilist theory. So you can say, if you look at from the perspective of Bretton Woods agreements, if you look at those discussions between the United States and Britain, you can say United States leadership in Bretton Woods found some kind of an actually a middle way between liberals and mercantilists. These, for example, IMF assistance, financial assistance to budget deficit countries, and IMF articles of agreement, for example, give some kind of a leeway, or you can say some kind of a capital controls power to control capital movements across the world to the nation states. So there you can say Bretton Woods agreement in terms of its framework is some kind of a mixed reconciliation between the liberals and mercantilists. It is not totally free trade and free movement of capital, but they're also not on that side of complete state intervention to the market like the socialist bloc. So you can say they're in the middle between some kind of a mixed economy in the 50s and 60s. So when it comes to the Marxist approach, they have a fundamental difference from liberal and mercantilist. What is that fundamental difference? Marxists generally look at the world capitalist system as a crisis-ridden system, and also these class conflicts, part of the nature of this capitalist system between working class and the capitalist, created some kind of a social and economic crisis, also exploitation of human beings by the capitalist class in the worldwide capitalist system, creates, for example, a lot of inequalities And capitalism, they argued, for example, put the production for profit and accumulation of capital before the human needs. So Marxists fundamentally criticize this system as a crisis-prone system, not only because of the anarchy of private property and private production system, but they also think that these class conflicts and inequalities can create social and political disruptions, especially class struggles between these rich and poor in certain countries. And they also, from the perspective of world system, the inequalities between the richer capitalist countries and poorer underdeveloped countries in the third world, they also could create problems in the future in terms of world system, because they think this existing capitalist trade relationships are also unequal. So they also criticize this free trade and free market operations. They actually mostly argues to end the production system depends on private property and capitalist market relationships. So they are on the side of the socialist planning. So during the 1940s and 50s, you can say the main discussion in terms of these three theoretical approaches to the international system or financial system or economic system looks like this. So since 1950s, your textbook also talks about the Mandel-Fleming model in terms of explanation of the international monetary system. And Mandel-Fleming model, actually, when it looks at the international economy and domestic economy, it talks about these three elements that are important for an economy. For a government who actually involved in free movement and free trade operations of the international capitalist system, in the Mandel-Fleming model, they said these three issues are very important and how states approach to these issues. If you accept free movement of capital and free capital mobility in your country, then, for example, you can control either the one in terms of these three variables, you can control only the one or two of these variables. You cannot, under Mandel-Fleming model, you cannot control these three at the same time, because it would create disturbances to the trade and international operations of capitalism. So for most countries that involved in this international capitalist system, you have to compromise in terms of which target or which one of these elements you want to control. So it depends on the historical period or target of the government at a certain point in time. For example, some governments can try to control capital mobility. Some try to control the exchange rate as a target. Some actually try to control the interest rate. But the Mandel-Fleming model says in international capitalism, you cannot control these three at the same time. So you have to compromise as a state. So, for example, you cannot, from your central bank or from your finance or economic ministry, you cannot just have free capital mobility, a free floating exchange rate, or a stable exchange rate that you determine within your control. And also you have an independent monetary policy to decide the interest rates according to the needs of your government. So you have to compromise one or two in choosing your economic policies in this free trade system. For example, they argue that if you choose accept the capital mobility, if you choose capital mobility, you have to choose one of those two. For example, either you have to sacrifice the stability of exchange rate, you have to actually leave it to the supply and demand and the volatility of the markets, or if you start to try to control the exchange rate by your government, and if you want some kind of a very stable exchange rate, and if you don't leave it to the market operations or open market operations to demand and supply, more than likely then you should leave the interest rates to those demand and supply in your financial system. You cannot control these three at the same time. For example, if government chooses the exchange rate controls, you can either choose to control the capital mobility or to control the interest rate to actually, because you need some kind of a foreign capital and free flow of goods and capital to your country. But if you have an exchange rate controls and try to stabilize the exchange rate through government controls, you can either choose to determine your interest rate or choose capital mobility in terms of how to attract foreign investment to your country. Because if you choose this stable exchange rate controls, more than likely it will affect the capital mobility to your country and will decrease the amount of foreign capital that will come to your country. So under those conditions, you have to have, for example, increasing interest rates to attract that kind of money. But at the same time, for example, if you start to try to control the interest rate also, then there will be a lot of problems for your free flow of capital in and out of your country. So there could be some kind of an potential crisis emerging from these kind of dilemmas or problems regarding those relationships between these three elements in free market economies. For example, if you both exchange rates and interest rates are controlled by the government, more than likely it will prevent the capital mobility altogether, because more than likely in international capitalist system, the foreign capital wouldn't prefer to enter into your country, because most of the interest rates and the exchange rate is determined by your government and by your economic policy. So there is some kind of a little room for the free market operations or the free trade and free market system. So it wouldn't be very attractive to the international financial capital to bring hot money or portfolio investments or sometimes direct investments into your country, because when they decided to repatriate their money, or when they actually decided to leave your country, since the market operations, demand and supply, has no control over the exchange rate and interest rates, more than likely they wouldn't prefer that country as an optional place for investment. So in these kind of situations, generally, if you accept this free movement of capital and free trade operations in this international financial system, you have to either sacrifice your control on the exchange rates of your country, or you have to sacrifice the determination of interest rates. Today, for example, in free floating currency system, especially after the 1970s, you can say most countries choose to control. It depends on the country, but most countries generally try to control the interest rates, because a lot of times their main business is with the domestic environment, and domestic interest rates, reduction of them or raising interest rates can be a much more direct influence on the economic policy, domestic economic policy. Because of this, more than likely, most of the time you can see capitalist governments choose these interest rates as a controlling element in this free trade and free market environment. Capital mobility and restrictions on capital mobility is not very advisable in this free trade system, in international capital system. And exchange rate stability is fixed exchange rates in this electronic trading environment of international financial system. It is also very difficult to control, because you can be very open to speculative financial attacks in today's 7/24 market environment. It is open to the international system, and if you accept free movement of capital, it would be very vulnerable to the sudden capital inflows and outflows. So this fixed exchange rate and providing stability to it is very difficult also. So most of the countries, from as far as I concern, since the post-Second World War years, they generally prefer to control their interest rates as a monetary policy in their domestic environment. And generally, central banks country gonna control this monetary policies of governments. Their main task in the 1950s and 50s. Okay, we will continue this chapter 8 next week. So thanks for listening. We will continue next week.